Hello everyone, welcome to the AOI streams, in-depth conversations with digital artists and experts to explore how blockchain technology is impacting the future of art. AOI, also known as Art on Internet, is the movement for emerging arts and technology. I'm Federica, and today I'll be your host. In this new Inner Codes Masterclass, we invite generative artist Lars Wander to learn about his inspirations, creative process, and watch a live demo of how he created How You See Me.
Let's start. Welcome everyone. Again, this is another beautiful masterclass that we're doing on the AOI Discord with our sub-movement of generative art, which is Inner Code. And this is the third episode of the second season. And I'm very excited because we had Martin Grasser, we had Lisa B. Direct, and today we have Lars Wander. So hi, Lars. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is really a treat for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we also have Tony from Artist Code. Hi, Tony. How are you?
No, good. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for being here again. It's so nice to have you again in another session. So
pleasure.
for those who perhaps are not familiar with Lars, I'm sure like most of you do, most of the crowd that I see in our space, I see some generative art crowd. He's a software engineer during the day and a computer artist at night. So I'm very excited to have Lars with us today. I was able to see his first solo exhibition in London a couple months ago, and it was very exciting. And I really fell in love with Lars' art. So super happy to be able to dive into his creative process today. So Lars, why don't we start? Tell us how you started, what's your background, how you got into generative art.
Yeah, gladly. So I got into generative art, I think, during a time when quite a few people did. It was early on during the shelter-in-place period of the pandemic, when I think a lot of us were looking for different outlets, especially those of us that were sort of stuck inside all day. And sort of two things triggered my interest. One, I joined this team at work so I work at Google, and I joined this team called Visual Analytics. And what we do is we build custom visualizations of the sort of large, complicated storage systems that Google deals with to provide better intuition and understanding for the software engineers and the site reliability engineers and the data analysts, where these systems sort of run at a scale and a complexity where your more traditional techniques like using line charts or reading log messages no longer really scales to meet the demands of the problem. And what we try to do is we try to build visual interpretations of these very large global scale systems that, this is the wording that my manager who runs the team always uses, that expose the intrinsic behavior of these systems. And we try to model it sort of along the lines and the thinking of the engineers who are most familiar with the system, and expose this behavior in a way that, at least for those that are more visually oriented, you can sort of parse and understand behavior at a scale that you really can't when you're using those more traditional techniques like I mentioned. And so that was one thing. And the other thing that triggered my interest was I think a few months before the pandemic started, I'd seen a video of a Penplotter in action. I think it was on Reddit or some site like that. And I just thought it was very mesmerizing to watch, and really fascinating to see this machine with this high precision, which if you're not familiar with a Penplotter, it's basically, you can think of it as like a 2D, 3D printer. It has an arm that moves along an XY plane, and you can tell it to move a pen up and down. And as a fun piece of maybe generative art history, the first computer artists, before they even really had screens to display their output on, would output their work using Penplotters only, which I can only imagine how difficult that is, because I think it's a real boon to have a screen where you can see roughly what your artwork's going to look like before the Penplotter draws it, and you discover a bug halfway through, for example. So I got one of these Penplotters then during the shelter-in-place period, because I needed something to do and to keep me company, and I was locked in this tiny apartment in New York City, and found that there was a lot of overlap between the work that I was doing at work and then the work with the Penplotter, because they're both very sort of visually oriented, but it was also very exciting and freeing to get to work in a medium where I didn't have to be so precise and deliberate in how I displayed information like I do for work, where it's basically the utmost importance is that you get the data that you're displaying correct and you're not making mistakes in how you display that data. Whereas when you're doing it for fun with a Penplotter, you have a little bit of creative liberty to find things that aren't only interesting, but are also maybe just intrinsically beautiful in the way they're drawn. And that's what got me started on generative art.
Nice. That's a very beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. And everything like I was thinking about right now is how was your first experience with the Penplotter when you got it? And it was also a time like the pandemic where we really had so much time in our hands. So I guess that you really, did you like dive into it? Like you spent like all of your day in there? Like how long did it take you to understand how it worked?
Yeah, great question. If you say that, I think back to when I first started and I ordered the Penplotter from Evil Mad Scientist. You should look them up. They make great Penplotters. They make the AxiDraw. And I ordered it knowing that there were two ways to feed commands to the Penplotter. And the first one is you give it an SVG file. It's sort of the format that you're probably familiar with for creating vector graphics. And there it interprets the path commands as instructions for where to move the pen down, move the pen along, and then lift the pen up again for each path. But there's another way to feed it commands, which is you can give it XY coordinates and pen up down commands directly. And this is probably overcomplicating it, and it's not maybe the way I would recommend a beginner get started if they're just getting started on pen plotting. But I thought it'd be more fun to sort of feed the Penplotter commands directly and maybe be in a certain sense a little bit closer to the machine in terms of how I'm controlling it. And I think in the week when I ordered it, I immediately started writing a library to control the Penplotter and generate sort of from a description of an image, generate commands or path commands that then the Penplotter can interpret. So I had written a little bit of Python code that I could start to create some artworks with and start to render them in the browser and to sort of preview what the Penplot would look like before it finishes. And then when the Penplotter arrived, mainly because the API is so simple and it's very straightforward to work with, I was able to plug it in and immediately get it working and start drawing, which was really rewarding. And I think at first I sort of had it sitting on the floor under my desk, which is a terrible idea. You'll kick it with your foot and then unalign it, so it's not a good place for it. And then I put it up on my desk, and it was like a very rewarding and addicting feedback loop where you could, in a very interesting way, see an algorithm that you've written be carried out as a series of instructions. And because maybe you're so familiar with the algorithm that you've written, it's always interesting and surprising to see it reinterpreted that way by the machine. And I sort of had the Penplotter running constantly. Fortunately, at the same time, I think Google Meet rolled out a feature that would block background noise. So I would have it running during my meetings at work. It was kind of just always drawing next to me. And I think during that period, I produced hundreds, if not thousands, of Penplots. I have like a ginormous stack. Now we're a little more tucked away, and I'm kind of afraid to take them out because every time I take them out and put them back in, you potentially damage them. And actually, some of those pieces, 19 of those actually, were in that show that you mentioned, Federica, that you saw in London, which was a real treat for me because it was kind of sort of an exciting period where I was really only focused on like doing what was fun with the Penplotter and sort of following the curiosity of like writing some code and seeing it carried out, playing with different mediums, playing with different ways of actuating the Penplotter, and never really focused on like, oh, like I'm going to sell these one day or like make art that like I think will speak to people. So it was really just really wonderful to then see people in London looking at these pieces beautifully framed and hung up on a wall in a beautiful gallery space, because that's not at all how I was approaching it. And very, very, very grateful for that.
It was definitely one of my favorite generative art exhibitions that I've been to because the whole effect that it was given, it was very, very beautiful. But I was thinking actually, now that you are talking, like, have you always been creative in some way, or like have you grown up? Because I know that you also make music, right? You produce music as well. So has it always been like a creative side of you, and then kind of during the pandemic, it kind of came out because of, all the reasons that you told us?
Yeah. I think, well, I've definitely always had like little side hobbies that were creative in one sense or another. I think for a long time in middle school and high school, I made little short videos, and then I got into producing music. I played guitar actively during that time, and I got into street photography for a while, which was a wonderful way to explore New York City. Yeah, I've always had creative projects on the side. And I think one thing that I always realized was a common theme among those was I was sort of approaching a medium or a space that was already very deeply established, and it was very difficult to sort of see a path to finding my own voice there in a space that had already been very deeply explored, and it always felt very daunting. And it was, of course, very fun to do, regardless of like finding your own voice or finding something new in the space. But what I think is so exciting and new about this generative art movement is that like you don't really have to take many steps in any direction to end up in a space that feels entirely new and unexplored. And even though generative art has been a movement that's been going on for maybe 60, 70 years now, with folks like Harold Cohen and Vera Molnar paving the way in the 60s and 70s, now computers are orders of magnitude faster and more powerful, which unlocks even more techniques and exploration that I think we're really only beginning to tap into. And that's something that really excites me very deeply, is that like it's a new medium. There's so much creativity happening, but it still feels like a place where you can really go deep and explore.
Yeah, absolutely. You were mentioning street photography, and I love that because I remember we were chatting about it at the exhibition, and I found it so interesting because it was one of the few things, like the first things that you told me when I asked you, like, where does your inspiration come from? And one of the first things you told me is like street photography in New York, and I was like, wow, because like it's such a different medium, and to me, it's so powerful that you connect the two things. So do you have any inspirations that you can show us? Anything that inspired you for maybe a specific piece or generally for your creative process?
Yeah, so I actually, you told me to prepare some influences, so I'm going to share my screen now. I think you can't talk about street photography without looking at Vivian Maier's work. And Vivian Maier's really interesting as an artist because she sort of worked in private for all of her lifetime and was generating this amazing and incredible, beautiful collection of street photography where, if you're not familiar with street photography, basically it's generally unposed. It's done sort of by, without really a lot of gear. It's an individual walking around with the camera and taking candid shots of the environment around them and the people around them. What really struck me about Maier's work is that she was working in private. She wasn't working to show this work anywhere. And all of her work wasn't really discovered until after she died, which is, I think, both on one hand very sad because she never really, I think, got to see the wonderful reception that her work deserved. But I think it's also very beautiful and romantic because it didn't really seem like she was striving to find that recognition. And she really just pursued it for the sake of the craft. And I would highly recommend Googling her name and looking at some of the pictures she'd taken. And it's remarkable to think that these are really like unposed photos found walking around in the streets. Another artist I really admire is Jonathan Higby. He has this wonderful series called Coincidences, where he finds these remarkable sort of juxtapositions all throughout the city. And like they're just very clever and brilliant, and they like make you stop and look and wonder. And for example, here's a billboard, and then here's a man walking, and you see this wonderful interaction here. The Coincidences book is fantastic. I have a copy of it, but there's some works in here that are just really fascinating to look at and really just wonderfully creative and kind of capture like a dynamism in the city that is really unique to him. But I think the artist that I admire the most and that really stuck out to me was Daniel Arnold, who is also based in New York City, and he captures artworks or captures these photos, which I think at first to me, like I didn't really get it because they don't look like very traditionally beautiful photographs. Like you have like a very hard flash on this man, and you can see the edge of the shadow, and it's sort of a poorly lit room, and you kind of wonder like, well, what's going on here? But then you realize and you look at the pieces and you see that the more you look at them and the more you engage with them, the more kind of comes out that's interesting. So for example, like the phone looks kind of anachronistic in his hand, as this cowboy dress, and he has all these animals arranged behind them, and some of them are looking at you. And like, what's going on with this monkey? Why is it hanging from the ceiling? And he has a photograph of exactly the same kinds of animals that he has arranged around him. And they're sort of just wonderful to engage with and look at more closely, because like you see these photographs and you wonder like, how on earth is he finding these things walking around in the city? And he captures these like very bizarre, beautiful interactions. And I think this idea that you can make beautiful pieces that aren't necessarily immediately captivating or immediately beautiful was something that really changed my perspective on how artwork works. And this is, of course, coming from someone who had never really studied artwork, so this maybe is like art 101 and super basic, but to me this was really eye-opening and really exciting, and got me actually really excited to do my own street photography. So highly recommend these 3 street photographers. There's a whole bunch more that just produce really beautiful, wonderful works. And it's kind of a very interesting genre. Yeah.
What do you think like you've taken from photography into your generative space? Because as you were speaking about this, I feel like there's a lot of mostly like the way that they work. There's a lot of like almost like randomness, but also there's also like some chance in what they're doing, right? So street photography is a lot about really it's not just about going out and taking pictures, it's really about capturing something specific. But at the same time, there's also this element of randomness that you can't really control when you go out in the street and take street photography, because you don't really know exactly what you're gonna find. You maybe have an idea, you may be like, oh, I might be looking for something like this, but you don't really know what is actually going to be in front of you. So is this something that you find perhaps connected to your work? How do you find this connection between photography and your work?
Yeah, I think you said it better than I could. I think that's exactly it. It's this very interesting juxtaposition between, like, there's some intention behind what you want to capture, but there's also this curatorial aspect where you kind of going out and you're taking a lot of pictures and you're going back through them and you're finding the ones that really speak to you, which happens quite a bit when you're making generative art, and you're sort of engaging with the system that's also very dynamic and surprising and sometimes behaves in very unexpected ways. I think, just like you said, there's a lot of kind of subtle parallels there between the street photography and the generative art that exists between those two.
Another thing that I was thinking about your work, and I heard a little bit about what you think. You know, one of your main concepts are we have perception, right? And I wanted you to expand a little bit on what perception is for you, and how you view it in your work, and how you use it when you create something.
Yeah. So I think the whole topic of perception is just really fascinating. As a little kid, I loved optical illusions. I would like spend days poring through them, and I think it just really blew my mind as a kid that our feeling that we're sensing objective reality isn't really true, and that there are all sorts of ways in which our mind plays tricks on us, maybe because it's finding shortcuts to help us better understand something, or just because of the ways that our perceptive system is built, that we're always sort of not really seeing the whole picture. And like one thing in particular that really stuck out to me that I learned recently was that certain optical illusions actually change in effectiveness based on your background and culture. So there's like a whole nature versus nurture element to the way perception is built, which is really like rather mind-blowing to me, and really like something fascinating. And what's also interesting is that sort of playing into this duality between sort of the objective and the subjective is that, especially when it comes to computer art, we sort of have these systems or computers that are highly precise, and they're incredibly quick and reliable. But at the same time, when we look at the outputs, an element of subjectivity plays into that. And not to spoil anything, but what will be part of what we'll be live coding is we're going to be looking at different ways to draw every single color on the screen. And something really interesting happens there where, well, depending on how you arrange those colors and how you lay them out, you get a very different sense of what the colors are. And kind of fun to me to use these systems that are very precise, and you can very much be very confident that what they're drawing is a certain thing, but then see visually something that maybe doesn't match that objective description of reality. And that's something that I think I'm just starting to really get into exploring and enjoying in my artwork.
That's beautiful. It really speaks about your work a lot. And I would love for you to show us a little bit of, perhaps, I see that you have your Instagram over there. So perhaps we can go through a little bit of your first works and we go into How You See Me.
Yeah, gladly. So I pulled up my Instagram. I used to share all of my works pretty much exclusively on my Instagram, and then I started to feel like it was maybe too much of a walled garden, and then I moved over to Twitter. But so I have my works kind of spread out over the internet. But so this was like one of the first plots that I created. This is like when I first hooked it up and finally got it to finish and draw end to end. And what's happening here is it's simulating a 3-body system. So you have 3 gravitational bodies, and they're sort of pulling on one another. And a line is drawn at every step between 2 of those bodies. So there's a really kind of remarkable pattern that comes out just by watching these bodies orbit one another. And I think that sort of comes from where in my day job, again, it's all focused around providing visual interpretations for complex systems. And those interpretations need to be like meaningful and well-defined. And it's kind of fun then to turn towards the generative art where you can sort of do something much more abstract and you can kind of just play with it and still have an interpretation of a system that's grounded by real rules and carried out by a computer where, you know, like, yeah, objectively it's following a certain set of rules that you've written for it. But what then comes out is surprising and different and sort of tells a different story than maybe the rules on their own would. And I sort of was playing with just fun ways of arranging lines. And actually, this was a really early piece that I made that I really liked, which was 25 ways of unwrapping a circle onto a line. I recently replotted a variation of this using watercolor that I then gifted to the Verse team for putting on such a wonderful show for me in London. But what's happening basically is you have a line and you interpolate its shape, a circle, and you interpolate its shape onto a line. And depending on how the circle is drawn, it breaks up in different ways and you get very different patterns. And it's kind of like a fun way to play with like having these rules again and watching them play out and getting results that are kind of surprising and also beautiful. But I then spent some more, these are kind of like basic early explorations with the Penplotter where you have a lot of fun drawing lines and distorting them. And this is kind of like your typical early computer art progression. And let's see, I think some of these, actually not yet, but this one was kind of fun. So this was, a friend of mine had introduced me to the NFTs, the ERC 721 tokens, kind of before they blew up and they became really popular. And he was trying to convince me that they're the perfect match for the plotter art because there's this element of repeatability in the plotter work that isn't present in traditional artwork. So you need something to describe them as non-fungible. So what I did here was, this is sort of a play on the fact that I was a little frustrated with the way the ERC 721 token standard was set up, which was, if you look at how it works, actually, it's kind of interesting. Your token, it isn't really a pointer to the artwork. Instead, the token is a URL that maps to a JSON payload, and that JSON payload is contains another URL that then maps to the artwork. And what I did for this token here is I first minted it on a mutable data store, so you can make changes to it after the fact, and then recorded its transaction hash and linked to it on Etherscan, and then had the QR code encode that link. So it's a self-referential loop where if you scan this, you get a link to Etherscan that mints this very NFT, which is something that probably shouldn't be possible, but the token standard allows. And it's kind of this fun self-loop impossibility that this piece here calls out. And then I spent a lot of time playing with these ribbons where it's sort of fun ways to find and draw occlusion. And here's the same piece, but with that occlusion disabled, so you can sort of see the underlying lines. And then I spent a lot of time playing with these polygon packings and watercolor, and sort of a very challenging medium to get right. And I'm a terrible artist in the sense of drawing by hand. So trying to understand how to make the computer make something sensible was a really fun journey. But yeah,
I wanted to know from Tony, how was your reaction when you first found Lars' work and you decided to bring into Artix Code? Like, how was the whole thing?
Well, I had first come across Lars just like late night digging, looking for, some wonderful art for my own collection. And I saw posted on his Twitter, and I randomly came across his Twitter, I guess, through mutuals that I had followed that were in the plotter community, because at that point, Lars had really been working on plotter stuff and was just exploring this for his own use, with no intention of really selling the work. And I know he had minted a few things on Object, and I saw Splat 3N, which, if you want to pull that up, it looked like nothing I had ever seen, like in generative art. And I went to Lars's website. Like, he had a blog where he would, write, and he spoke about his work at Google. And I was just looking at this piece, and I kind of freaked out. I was like, this is incredible. And and I reached out to him and I said, can you mint this? And he's like, yeah, sure. Can you list this? I said, yeah. So he listed it on Object as an edition of 10, and I bought all 10 right away. I was like, this guy is special. I don't know how the hell he did this or what he's doing, but he did it with code, and I'm all in. And this, I had no intention of representing anyone or working as an agent, and at that point I wasn't working with Artix Code. I just wanted his work and selfishly wanted to own this as a one of one, right? So I bought all 10, and there was another piece on there that he had made earlier called Splat 2N, and I bought one of those editions. That was also an edition of 10, and I felt like in a giving mood, and I ultimately regret doing so. I left the other 9 up there, and then I saw, and it's of the same algorithm, and it's wonderful, in a more rectangular shape. Yeah, there it is. And so, these splats of color they just spoke to me on an emotional level. It looked almost hand done, and I didn't know what it was about them, but I knew it was special. And then I saw he had posted these rubber bands. So it's a sequence of how many times you can, and Lars, correct me if I'm wrong, how many times you can fold over a rubber band. Was it four creases?
I think so. So it's counting these little pairs. So it's another interpretation is, imagine you have like a road running down the middle of this, and you have to cross over the road n times, so 4 times here, in both directions, and you have to start in one point and end in that point. And it's counting all the ways in which you can start at one place, cross over it n times, and then end up back at the end, which you can write code that can give you very high confidence, or you can prove that it enumerates all the various ways you can do this, but and you can then visually draw and represent what the final sequence is.
And it was so simple, right? Like, I think the first output is literally just a circle that is the rubber band, and then there's the second one is the rubber band bent in half, and then it progresses onward until you've got a ton of them together, and it zoomed out. It just looks like this grid where the colors kind of, it's gradation of the monochrome, but when you zoom in, you see all these little rubber bands. And they also reminded me the concept of it just being a rubber band was so cool. And then also they remind me of like little lumache, like snails, right? Like, so I just thought they were really cute. And I was like, this guy, he's got such range. Like you have these splashes and splats of color, and then you have this evidently, plotter type work. And I really geeked out. I was just like, this is incredible. And I tweeted it, and I think Kylo came along and bought up all the rest of the 2N splat edition. And then from there on, Lars and I just kept talking as, a collector, and dish out some advice here and there on just what I thought, was good for the market, stuff like that, and just friendly convos. And that went on for months. And I had asked him, I'm in love with this splat algorithm. Do you think you could mint something on ETH? So he went to the drawing table and he put in, I think it was like 7 months of research to further thresh out his exploration with generative paint mixing. And that led to an addition to a one-of-one on Foundation called Gentle Dissolution, I believe. And that blew me away. And he sent me over a print to London, and it's been hanging in my kitchen, which is a very central part of my life, as you may know. And so that piece was super special to me. And I said to him, can never have just one of one thing if I've learned my lesson in collecting. So would you mind if we, if I commissioned 2 works? So he did that work. And then as if 7 months of research wasn't enough, he explored the algorithm further into making what is now How You See Me. So it was really this long journey of him. I mean, time passed, and I was just like, this guy, I wasn't, some collectors would be like, oh, where's my art? I was like, this guy's serious. Like, he's putting in the work. Because we would talk about, how's it going? How's the work going? And, I'm not very technically savvy when it comes to code. At Artix Code, Sophia's the programmer, but he would give me some explanations on what he was studying. I was like, that went over my head. I have no idea what you said, but it sounds like rocket science, and I'm here for it.
I do remember, Tony, I remember you told me that, I don't know if it was for How You See Me. I remember you told me you guys were on a call, and like Lars would like show you what he was doing, and you would like comment kind of like live.
So yeah, that was later on. So basically, fast forward to How You See Me. Lars minted the first 3 of them, I believe, which was a commission for me, Kylo, and the Funny Guys. And at that point, people were really talking about Lars, right? He had Gossamers on FX Hash. He had Geodes. He had, there was a third project, the Folded project. What's the name of it? It's
Unfolded. Yeah.
Unfolded. Sorry. And, here's someone who, much like Vivian Meyer, was making work with no intention of it really being out there. All of a sudden, and thank God we found Lars's work in his lifetime and not afterwards. All of a sudden, there's all these people coming and showing interest in his work. And Lars reached out to me and asked if I would represent him, like, as his agent. And at that point, I was just working in finance law and had no intention of being an agent. And I was like, let me think about it. I don't know. Like, man, like I'm working on high yield bonds. Like, I don't represent people. But I thought about it. And at the same time, Sophia was visiting me in London, and she was like, you're an agent. You're not a lawyer. And I was like, I guess you're right. And Marty Grasser reached out, I think a day or 2 days after Lars, and it all happened at once. So I was like, all right, I'm going all in on this. I joined up with Artix Code, and we hit the ground running on How You See Me. And I was meeting with Lars to just, as you were mentioning, Fede to go over the outputs and just find, do assist a little bit with curation and finding which outputs that excited us the most and we had a gut reaction to. And I mean, it's actually really hard because of how you see me. They're all so freaking amazing. I mean, as you can tell by all 19 outputs, but that was a lot of fun just going through these pieces and figuring out, what we thought would be a cohesive, curated collection. And Verse reached out and we put 2 up on there, and that was the beginning of working with them. And the rest is really history. I mean, the collection's massive success, and Lars knocked it out of the park. And I think it's just really the beginning of his journey. And I'm grateful to be here alongside him. I feel like I just ran on for way too long. I want the focus to be more on listening to Lars's silky smooth voice. So that's all from me.
I want more Tony. You tell my story so much better than I ever could. Thank you. You're way too kind.
No.
Thanks, Tony. That was beautiful. I would love to talk about this more, but I really want to get into the how you see me coding situation that we're talking about. So, Lars, talk to us about how you see me and how it started, and show it to us as well.
Yeah, so here I have the code. I can maybe run some outputs and see what's happening. It's not the fastest. It does quite a bit of computation. I'll explain a little more how it works when we get into the live coding portion, but you can see it's kind of like any other generative algorithm. You run it and it's telling me all sorts of stuff here in the log as it runs and gives me some output. But I think what might be more interesting is to look at like some of the very first outputs from the algorithm. So when Tony was saying that I was doing a lot of research, it was really focused around finding ways to better represent or better approximate color mixing. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a little more detail when we do the live coding. But the first kind of real breakthrough was with these images here, where I started with like a basic fluid simulation that runs on the GPU. I was mixing yellow paint and blue paint and getting green. And typically when you're dealing with the computer color space, yellow and blue gives you gray, which is very gross and not a very appealing color mixture. But here, these first couple outputs were sort of proof of concept showing that you can mix these colors and you can get the right colors in between. Where it sort of started to change was when I realized that, well, fluid simulations have been done a million times and they're not very pretty. Well, they can be, but I think what was more interesting was applying those same fluid mechanics, but instead of to a sea of particles where every pixel might have a concentration of paint, you really only apply the forces to the boundaries of the shapes. So you have shapes and ways and colors and ways of representing them that are maybe a little more computer art native, where you're not dealing with fluid concentrations, you're dealing with shapes with hard boundaries, but you're still distorting them according to the same principles. And I can start to page through these really quickly. And I got really excited because I was posting outputs like this to Twitter and people were like, hey, that's a turkey. And I'm like, that's right, it looks like a turkey. I wasn't expecting that. Or like, there's a dolphin in this one. And it started to become very exciting where, yeah, here's the dolphin. And very exciting to see these kind of very simple blobs become really like kind of gain a life of their own. And you can see I was exploring with different paint concentrations. I was looking at maybe finding interesting textures to add to them. And this is like very early days, and I was, I think, posting quite a few of these outputs to Twitter and just to see people's reactions. And at some point, I started bringing in more of the fluid dynamics again and getting these kind of very interesting distortions. For a while, these were kind of interesting. And I found you can sort of play with the step size or sort of how frequently updates happen when you run this code and you start to get more distinct boundaries again. And these were rather interesting. I started to feel like, and you can kind of see it, like very fascinating patterns and very interesting, and maybe something I'll go back to revisit, but they look maybe a little too skeletal and a little too grim, and that was not really what I was after. But still fun to play with and interesting to see, and here's kind of an example of like a face that pops out. These early outputs, interesting to see here. I really cranked up the resolution and was looking at like what happens if we really tried to simulate this with like a very high density, and you get like very fine shapes in here that are very interesting to look at and kind of very pleasing. Again, using the same paint mixture simulation to get these colors that you wouldn't otherwise be able to if you were just mixing an RGB space. Let's see. Sort of playing with these shapes some more, getting some kind of interesting outputs, playing with different starting shapes, seeing what they look like when they're distorted, and maybe jump ahead a little more quickly. And eventually, I think it was around this time when I decided that I think the best outputs kind of came from using those hard edges and just distorting those fairly gently. And I think, yeah, this output I really enjoyed. And that was one when I felt like this was the direction the project should take. And over the coming weeks, I started playing more and more with using different colors and using different starting shapes. This one I also really liked. It was an early output from the experimentation. And it was around this time that I think I realized that this was pretty close to ready. And I think, let's see if we can find it. This was mint number 0 for the project, so that we're mint number 1 for the project. And then from this point onward, it was really the journey of evolving the code, changing it, and maybe not using it in the traditional long-form generative art sense, where you have one body of code with many different hashes producing many different outputs, but instead having it be sort of a constant dialogue between myself and the code and editing it and changing it to sort of search for various aesthetics. You can see like here, if you reduce the resolution of the very fine-grained shapes and only use 3 points per circle instead of like 10,000, you get triangles, which actually starts to also be very interesting in terms of how they get distorted. And you get some very beautiful outputs. This was one of the mints. I think this one we sold through Verse when they did their chromatics exhibition. And you can see it was really fun to just constantly explore and push and play with different ways of composing the shapes, composing the colors. And you can see it can be quite challenging to pick outputs that you really like because they're all kind of interesting in their own way. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these where obviously only 19 were picked, so it's a tiny fraction, but and it was a lot of help from Sophia and Tony during it, where I was very hesitant to share a lot of the outputs here in the middle once the series was in motion, because I was sort of afraid that maybe Twitter would get really attached to one output, but then I wouldn't want to mint that as the next one, and then who knows, maybe they'd be upset. So I had to rely on Sophia and Tony to sort of help guide and get a sense for what worked and what didn't. But yeah, so this is the sort of the progression of the series, and every so often you might see one that made it up into the final set of mints. I see my Discord crashed here. Are there any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll get into the live coding and we can talk about computer colors.
We have a question from Discord. So Zephyr Wins is asking, how are the colors you choose influenced by paint mixing?
Yeah, so the colors chosen were mixed using the primary colors that were made available in this Spectral paint database, and I'll talk about that in more detail now. But so we can jump into the coding, but before we do that, so there's this theory of how paints mix that was developed in the 1930s by these two physicists, Kubelka and Munk. And sort of key to being able to apply that theory, you need a pair of spectral curves for the paints that you want to mix. So there is this scientist, Roy Berns, and he had a graduate student working under him, and I highly recommend checking out this thesis. It really explains the theory behind it and the physics behind it better than I could. And it's, his graduate student, Yoshio Okamura, and what they did is they sort of reverse engineered these spectral curves, and they published the curves themselves, but not with enough detail to actually apply to the paint mixing. And they kind of look like this for every single paint. So you have a reflectance curve, an absorption curve, and it's describing for every wavelength how much light is absorbed and how much light is reflected. And using that, you can combine these for different paints, and it turns out all that you really have to do is take a weighted average for every bucket in that frequency spectrum, and take the weighted average between the two spectral curves for the paints that you're mixing together. So the someone says, Ben, so the way the colors were influenced or chosen by was basically using the base paints here and then mixing them into concentrations that looked aesthetically pleasing, which was most of the fun there. All right, so I hope that answers the question. Let's take a look at some coding. So I see we have very little time here, so maybe we'll only do an abbreviated demo and we might not get all the way through it. But so what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about computer colors, and we'll sort of start with the very basics. So how are colors represented by the computer? You've probably heard of this before, but when you're dealing with computer colors, you have 3 channels, RGB. So you have these 3 channels, and each of them takes on 256 possible values. And something kind of interesting going on here already. We have sort of 3 choices that are made for us. So why RGB, why 3 channels, and why 256 values. So actually a question for the audience here. Why do you think we have RGB, and why 3 channels in particular? As a hint, the answer actually, it's sort of physiologically based. It's based in our biology. I'll leave the silence as pondering. So I'm sure we're all thinking hard. So it's actually really interesting. It comes from the fact that we have 3 cone cells in our lines. So we have these L, M, and S cone cells. And if we look this up, we see basically we have a cone cell that responds to short wavelengths of light, and that's roughly blue light. We have a cone cell that responds to medium wavelengths and long wavelengths, and those are green and red respectively. What we're seeing here basically is that frequencies of light that are very short will be activated by this cone cell, and that are very long will be most activated by this cone cell. So we have RGB as our 3 base colors, mainly because they map well onto those cone cells, and because we have 3 of them, we can move around in that 3-dimensional space that those cone cells afford us. 256 values is also kind of interesting, and there's a meaning behind that too, but it's not based in biology, but instead it's based in how computers represent numbers. And the smallest sort of easily addressable numerical value that modern hardware can represent is an 8-bit value, and that can take on 256 possible states. So 256 is sort of a convenient value that, one, allows for enough flexibility to display very smooth gradients, but also fits very conveniently into what our modern hardware represents. So let's draw some colors. So here we have, we're running just a simple little web server, and we're evaluating this little bit of JavaScript code. So let's create a color. So we'll say that we have an RGB color, and we'll give it, let's say, no red, no green, and maximum blue. And what does that look like? Oops, we have to actually fill it too. What we're saying basically is let's create a rectangle that's the size of the window wide and the size of the window tall. And then when we draw that, we get blue. So we can, we can do the same here, and we can, for example, look at what pure red looks like. That's pure red, and we can look at just green. That's just green. And it's kind of fun to think about. We're actually already painting with light right here. So we have our display has these pixels, these red, green, and blue pixels, and we're setting their intensity for all the values on the screen, which is kind of already very fun. If we activate 2 of the channels at once, and this is maybe kind of interesting, so what color do you think red and green makes? It's kind of surprising. It actually makes yellow. it's a bit odd. We can also take a look and say, what color does green and blue make? And this is cyan. And now, finally, we have kind of an interesting color here, magenta, which if we actually go back to the LMS cone cells, if you look and if you imagine something that activates both the blue and the red cone cell at once, there's actually no single frequency that does that. So kind of what that hints at and what's going on here. So some people might say that magenta is a fake color. It's not really a color that exists in reality. But I think maybe what's important to think about is the fact that no color is really real. They're all sort of imaginary inside of our head. And really what a color is it's a spectral power distribution. It's a collection of wavelengths. It's never just a single one. Or it can be a single one, but many times it's actually many wavelengths. So one object that looks green to you and another object that looks like it's the identical shade of green might have entirely different spectral power distributions. There's entirely different sets of wavelengths coming off of them, but our eyes perceive them to be the same, which is kind of fascinating and really bizarre. But so one little fun note here is that when we activated two of those colors at once, we got cyan, magenta, and yellow. And if we add black to that, you'll see that this is CMYK, which is a color model that's commonly used for printing, and it's no coincidence. It's that it looks like this. And I guess I'll maybe get a little too derailed with the time that we have to explain how that works here. But kind of interesting here that just by playing with sort of the most basic thing we have available to us, which is activating each channel to its maximum value, we start to sort of see these effects of these various color spaces. So like I mentioned before, we're going to try and draw every color. So let's start by drawing, let's say, every shade of red. So we were saying before that we have a channel size of 256. And let's create a square so we can fit every value for that channel in that square. So let's say that our side length is the square root of the channel size. Now we have, that should be a 16 by 16 square right there. And now let's iterate over all the possible values. So let's say R is 0, R is less than channel size. We iterate over all those possible channel activations, and we say and basically we're saying here for every value of red that we see from 0 to 256, we're going to set that to be the color of a single pixel. So we're going to fill this at coordinates x and y with a pixel size of 1. But we need a coordinate, and let's say that x is equal to the channel modulo 16. So basically the way you can think about that is for every red value, we divide by 16 and we take the remainder. And then if we divide by 16, we get the y coordinate. If we draw this, we get a super tiny square here. And let's save that. Let's say that's all red. It's tiny. And now if we look at that and we zoom all the way in and we take a look at all the pixels that we just drew, you'll see that we sort of went from the topmost corner here, we iterated over it, and went piece by piece, and we filled in and got the most intense value of red here. So maybe not super interesting just yet. Let's scale that up a little bit, and let's start looking at what happens if we look at multiple channels at once. So let's take this little bit of code right here and turn that into a function to make that a little more convenient. Let's say we'll call that to coordinate, and we'll return the pair of the value modulo 16 and the value divided by 16. We can say the channel that we just drew here, and let's refresh. And oops, we can see we still draw the same picture, and now now let's do the same thing, but for the blue channel as well. So now for every red value, we're also going to draw every blue value and get our coordinates here. And in the same way that we just iterated over every pixel in the 16 by 16 square, let's create 16 by 16, 16 by 16 squares. So we're now dealing with basically all the channels in blue and all the channels in red, the cross product of the two. So we multiply these two. And then let's set our blue pixel value. And then let's say that our x coordinate is going to be, like I was saying, a 16 by 16 square in blue, and then every value in red, and we'll do the same for the y coordinate. And now if we draw this, something went wrong. I think this is the classic demo effect when you're live coding. Let's see. Oop. Yeah, here we go. So, and just to zoom in again, because this is very tiny, let's say all red, green, tiny. And let's zoom in again. So now what we're looking at, and it's starting to get a little more interesting, is we have, again, in this top corner, the 16 by 16 square, where our green channel is entirely empty, and we sort of iterate over all the possible red values. And then over all the larger 16 by 16 squares, the green slowly gets more intense. And like I was showing before, when we have all red and all green, we get yellow in this bottom corner here. So let's add our last color here. Let's do the same for blue. Or sorry, I mislabeled. This is blue. This was green.
We have a question from the audience. So Xerox Techno says, do you usually play in RGB space versus other color models, HSB, HSL, etc.? Yeah,
great question. So, so RGB and kind of what we're part of this exercise, what we're showing is it's an interesting color model because it's very native to your screen, but it's maybe not a fantastic color model for thinking about how you want to represent colors. So there's one quirk here in RGB. So technically, we're not even using RGB. We're using what's called sRGB, and that stands for standard RGB. And it was defined in the 1970s for CRT displays. It has a gamma correction, so it's basically it's not a linear color space. So if you do mathematical operations in RGB, they maybe don't behave quite like you expect. So even drawing things like simple gradients, that gamma correction will kind of get you in trouble. The nice thing about the color space is that this person asked about is that HSL and HSV, there's another one, HCT, which maybe we can talk about, is that they sort of more intuitively for how we think about colors allow you to manipulate and sort of carve up that color space. Because if you're thinking about doing anything with generative colors, you sort of kind of want to be able to define mathematically or define using a set of rules which colors are good, and then also how to move from good colors to other good colors, because you maybe want to draw a gradient or you want to find colors around a certain color that sort of map nicely to another one. So I actually don't use HSL and HSV and HCT very much. Most of my work has been using this Kubelka-Munk space, which I'll show in a minute. And then the other one has been using spectral power distributions, which I can send out some links for reading. And they're interesting to me because they sort of more closely mimic the physics of how light interacts with objects in the first place, which I think from an artistic perspective is kind of fascinating, that we can use computers to model and sort of represent some fundamental parts of our reality and have the computer sort of carry out our questions for us that we might have about these color spaces. But really quickly, I'm going to finish drawing the blue channel here. Let's see, so we have red, green, and blue. This was supposed to be green. And now we want to add our blue component. And when we run this, it's going to be quite slow. So at this point, if you do the math, if we actually didn't size the canvas correctly, if we look at what happens if you take 256 and raise it to the third power, you get roughly 6 million. So we're dealing with roughly, 16 million. You get roughly 16 million colors, which if you're making canvas calls, if you have to make 16 million of them in a row to draw a picture, it's probably going to be quite slow. And technically, what you should be using here is a compute shader, but I think this is a little bit easier to follow to understand exactly how we're iterating over all the colors. And let's reload this to see if it worked. But it might take like another typo.
In the meantime, we have another question as well from Jimena Bonavida. She's also an incredible generative artist. She's asking, do you think of your work as digitally native or physically native? And then she says it's very, very beautiful.
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, is it digitally native or is it physically native? Yeah, you know what? I haven't really thought about that, and I think it probably falls somewhere in between. I think like some things are very interesting for the work that I like to do and the work that I want to do. I sort of want to explore ways in which we can use the computer in a unique way to generate artwork, and that's kind of interesting here because I think that the computer can also help us explore the physical domain in a way that you couldn't otherwise. Because, for example, we have, thanks to the help of physics, modeled and understood many ways in which the way light interacts with the world around us. And it's thanks to that modeling work that we can then recreate and run and evaluate these models using the computer to get a sense of or to recreate either whether it's colors or shapes or physical phenomena. And I think that a lot of interesting work kind of sits in that juxtaposition between the two, where you're sort of taking cues from the physical world, but then you're taking advantage of the fact that the computer can run and evaluate those cues in ways in which you can't maybe fully do so without the help of the computer. So wonderful question. That's really interesting. So here, if we zoom out, we've now drawn every single color right here. So we start in the very top corner, we have these tiny 16 by 16 blocks, which are then composed again into 16 by 16 blocks where we modulate the green channel. And now we're doing the same thing with the blue channel. And I think maybe again a question for the audience, when you look at this, does it, like, what comes to mind, I guess? Does it surprise you at all, or is this roughly what you expected?
Let us know in the comment section. Don't be scared, don't be shy. I see some people are typing right now. We also have a comment from Jen's Lab thanking you for showing us the beautiful theory. I'm
a big fan of Jen's work. He also does some really beautiful plotter pieces. You should check out his Twitter and Instagram. He creates his own drawing machines and then draws with them, which I think is really wonderful.
Thanks, Jens, for your comment. Yeah, let us know in the comment section. I see someone say, Riz saying it reminds me of shaders.
Yeah, it does. So it's this would be like so shaders. If you don't know, they're ways of writing code that is evaluated once on every single pixel on your screen. And what I'm doing here is sort of a bad way of approximating shaders. As you saw, it took maybe 20 seconds to render, and this is probably not how. It's not the fastest way to do this, but it is maybe one that's a little bit easier to follow. If you were to try and recreate this with shaders, it would take some more steps to jump through. But at least when I first did this, I was really surprised because it doesn't really look like every color is in here. Like when I look at this, I feel like there's a whole lot of blues, a whole lot of reds. I don't really see any deep forest greens or any very rich oranges. I feel like somehow some of the colors are getting lost in here. What also gets interesting, and this might take too long to evaluate here, so if we jump back, I've rerun this a few times with some other orderings, if you change the order in which you modulate between the various channels, and you look at that, you get dramatically different looking pictures, which I think is just really fascinating. the fact that the order in which you draw the colors has such a big impact on the final image. Maybe on one hand shouldn't be surprising because, well, we are looking at 16 million individual colors laid out end to end here, but it's also really fascinating that the way in which adjacent colors influence our perception is made very visible here, because we can take these, for example, going from first or iterating from green to red to blue versus blue to red to green versus green to blue to red. We have some, it looks like entirely different colors are being represented in here, which I think is really fascinating and just a lot of fun to explore, which is something that you can't really do in other mediums, and it's kind of a great example of like using the computer to explore and be curious. But I realize we're over time here. I don't want to eat up into anyone's time.
No, not at all. Like, I'm really enjoying this. So I know that, we have the audience. Everybody's loving this as well. I'm seeing some comments so far. So please go ahead.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so really quickly, let's talk about we'll do an example of the Kubelka-Munk paint mixing. So when I was showing the spectral curves before, a key thing that I left out was that the curves themselves, if you have them with enough detail, they're considered the IP of the paint manufacturer. So I was really fortunate to be shared, or to have them shared with me to use for this artwork here. However, I can't share the content of those curves. I can use them for commercial work, but I can't share the content. I can share right here what the shaders look like that combine them and produce colors with them. And what we can do also is do some drawing with them. So the way that the paint mixing works here basically is, instead of dealing with a red, a green, and a blue channel and combining light, we're now thinking in terms of paint concentrations. So if we open up this demo here, so right now it's telling me that we don't have any colors being drawn, but what I do is I take two canvases that are the same size as the final canvas that we want to draw, and I take the red, the green, and the blue channel from the first canvas, and then the red, the green, and the blue channels from the second canvas, and I use the intensities of those colors to represent the intensities of the underlying paints right here. So what does that mean? So say we take this first canvas, and in the same way that we drew something before, if we do, say it's entirely filled with the first channel, and then for the second canvas, we draw nothing at all, but we have to actually draw something. If we draw this, we get just white. So this is the titanium white color right here. So we're saying we fill this canvas with just the red channel, which maps to titanium white, and then when we run our paint mixing, we end up with just white, which maybe isn't super interesting on its own. But what we can do now too is we can, for example, mix in a little bit of vanadite yellow, and now we get a slightly yellow canvas. So if we look at the underlying canvases that we're drawing on, which I keep copies of down here, what we're actually drawing and what the typical light mixing is doing in the traditional sense is we're drawing here entirely red and a little bit of blue, which gives us this sort of off magenta color. If we, for example, go back to just white, that canvas becomes just red, and our final canvas becomes just white. So say we want to draw something on top of this. What we can do is we could say that we now want to draw a smaller area, like let's say, and now we say we draw a 100 by 100 pixel square somewhere on the screen right here. We see that on our underlying canvas that looks like blue, which we expect. And now on our top canvas, we get yellow. And we can start to do some mixing here. If we take a color from the second canvas, and we say, we want to fill that with, say, ultramarine blue. And we draw another rectangle that's slightly offset, we can see that we're starting to actually see some mixing that's happening between these colors. However, if we look at the underlying canvases again, it's just a blue canvas on the underlying square, or on the underlying canvas, and here it's just red on this canvas down here. And it's this principle basically of using these other canvases as buffers and then combining them using the paint mixing that basically powers all of the paint mixing that we see in How You See Me. We're sort of going back to that question in terms of what are the color spaces that I use. It's much more convenient to think in terms of paint concentration. So say you want to draw a certain shape or a color that you want to draw, then you want to have that fade smoothly into another color. If you're doing this in some color space like HSL, where you have your hue, your saturation, and your luminance, and you want that to fade smoothly into another color, you sort of have to make some decisions about what's the shape of the curve that you're going to draw connecting one point to another. Whereas if you're dealing simply in paint concentrations, you can simply draw a straight line and get a very beautiful blend that sort of mimics reality in the underlying paint mix. So that was a very quick demo showing roughly how this paint mixing works. Are there any other questions?
That is beautiful. I'm mind blown. I would keep watching all day, to be honest. I see a lot of comments from the audience as well. Mala is saying thank you so much for this incredible masterclass. Everyone is super happy about being able to look at this. It's really, really powerful. And I wanted to know from Tony, what does it feel like? This is not the first time, right, that you see this kind of process?
Yeah, I mean, I've been there at Lars's place from where he's doing all this right now, looking over his shoulder. It's mind blowing. Yeah, he'll tell you, like, I'll be behind him, like, kind of like cackling, like, ah! What is going on? It's brilliant. It's amazing to see someone string together, this code and come up with such brilliant outputs. And as I said before, I'm just grateful to witness it. Really. Yeah. I'm so glad that we do things like this so that everyone gets to peek into the process and see really how layered it is, and it's really cool to have Larss start from the most simple aspect of just creating colors, or not colors that are colors, and leading up to the actual composition of full-fledged pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. Lars, can you share with us the whole, perhaps you have like a page with all of the 19 outputs that you put out, so we can take a look at them as we have our last question. If there's any questions from the audience, please send them now. We're going to be closing the session quite soon. I know that some of you joined us a little bit later, so don't worry, we're recording this. We're gonna replay it again, so don't worry about it. I wanted to ask you before, actually, how did you get to the number 19? Does it have a special meaning, or it was more like, you had to choose these 19 pieces?
Yeah. So I feel like certain numbers have maybe certain feelings or shapes associated with them. I think I particularly like the feeling of number 19. It's maybe popped up in my life in a few places, so it feels suited. It's also the number of pieces that we had on exhibition at the show that Verse did for us. And I mean, the goal was really to have a number of pieces that was small enough to feel kind of intimate, but big enough to sort of show some of the diversity of the outputs. And here I can scroll through them and you can sort of get a quick sense of what these look like. But it's, I guess, within that range of not being too small, but not being too large. 19 felt well suited to capture that.
I keep seeing them and being like, oh, that's my favorite. No, that's my favorite one. There's my favorite. It's like there is no favorite. They're all so good.
How long did it take you to get to these 19 pieces? How
Yeah.
the decision must have been like, I don't know. I would feel like I would just go to bed and like think about all of them, be like, oh, maybe that one that I didn't pick.
I know it's very painful to pick some, knowing that there's others that you don't get to share in the same way. But I don't. Well, let's see. When did we first mint this one? So it took. We did this. Let's go to the history when that loads.
I mean, if you think about it, look back to when the first splat was minted, Lars.
Yeah.
And how long it took you to do that up until mint 19 of this. It's kind of all just connected, and that's how long it took. So over like what? It's like a year.
Yeah, very true, very true. It's been a year of a lot of playing with it and having fun and working on this. Yeah. But yeah, so this was end of July, so it's been maybe roughly 6 months of work, or a little less than that, to get to 19. And it was constant minting and playing and sharing things with Tony and Sophia that led to this.
That's awesome. I see that I see some people that were typing before. If you have any last questions or comments, please leave them now. We also have a comment from Jimena. She's saying this is so perfect. Zero Techno says, thanks for showing the whip outputs and progression. How and when do you decide a program is finished and to stop iterating and tinkering with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I feel like there's a part of me that if I didn't keep it in check, I would keep tinkering and iterating forever, and then it would never really get anywhere. But I think I guess at some point you have to release something if you want to share it with the world and get other people excited about it and talking about it. So I feel like once I got this output for all the sort of initial iterating and tweaking, I felt like it was very strong on its own. And it felt like immediately very different from other generative art that I'd seen at the time. So the fact that, well, one, it was very beautiful, at least to my eyes. The fact that it captured a lot of sort of very interesting forms and shapes that you can sort of let your mind interpret and see what you want. For me, was enough to say that this was good for mint number one. And it became harder and harder as I went on to sort of say okay, this is the one that's going to be number 9, for example. This is the one that's going to be number 10, because you sort of have, other pieces already in the series that you have it being placed in the context of, but you also don't want to push it too far and then create something that looks like an entirely different series where you're not really staying within the constraints that you've created for yourself. So it's a great question. I don't have really a very solid answer for exactly when, but I think that sort of lays the groundwork. I also want to call out really quickly, I see that Alejandro mentioned that the interview with Wurs was very helpful to him. I think what I mentioned there and what I'd like to share with everyone here is that there's this software called Mixbox, which implements the Kubelka-Munk mixing, but does it purely in RGB space. However, it doesn't rely in the end product on those constants that you can't share, which anyone can use. However, it sits behind a license. So if you want to use it, you can reach out to the Mixbox team and you can get the very beautiful color blending that I was talking about. But it works entirely in RGB space. So it's even more convenient. You don't have to write code like this to sort of model paint concentrations. You can play with it on your own for your own generative artwork if that's something you'd like to do.
Awesome. That's a great tip. I see a couple more. I see Alejandro is texting again. He also has a question. He got here a little bit late. It's okay, no worries. So you're doing the geometry with vanilla JS and using GL for reading and mixing pixels?
Yes. Well, so actually the geometry for how you see me is also being done on the GPU. Then there's some vanilla JS to rasterize it and draw it, and then it goes back to the GPU to do the paint mixing.
Perfect. Alejandro, don't worry because we will replay the episode. And also, Lars is on our Discord. So if you do have more questions for him as well, tag him on our Generative Lounge. It will be the channel under in our code. You will find the channel called Generative Lounge, where we usually talk about generative art. We have any questions for artists, we post them there, we talk about it. So if you have any more questions for Lars, please feel free. In fact, let's move the conversation there. If anyone else has any questions for Lars, or you want to ask him for any tips or advice, make sure you stay on our Discord as well, so we can continue chatting. I don't see any more questions coming at the moment. Well, there's Tim Bain. Okay, there was a comment thanking us for being here. Thanks so much, everyone. It was really, really wonderful. I know we're a little bit over time, but we always end up being a little over time with the sessions because they're so amazing, and we always have to stay a little bit longer. But it was really wonderful, and I'm so happy we managed to do this, Lars. It was awesome to have you here and finally to see, your creative process, your inspirations, have this visual idea of how you work. So thank you so much for taking the time. It was really great.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Tony, as well, for being with us again. It's been wonderful to chat with you, and you doing such an amazing work with this artist. And it's always awesome to hear from you and your perspective.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you so much for doing these and putting them on a regular basis. It's so great to get to dive into this.
Have a nice day, everyone, or evening.
Thank you for listening to the AOI streams. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and subscribe to listen to more stories from the pioneers of the ecosystem.